Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's session. My name is Sara Rayan, and I'm the D&I Programs Coordinator for our Canadian Talent Acquisition Team. Firstly, I want to say a sincere thank you to everybody for taking time out of your day to join us for today's session. Me and Bryan are very excited to have you here today and discuss the impactful allyship, how to navigate and empower change together. Now, before I start the session, I did want to let everyone know that I have our wonderful TA colleagues in the chat. So for any general questions, any recruiting questions, they are there to be able to answer and help guide you. As for other questions, myself and Bryan will be taking them throughout our conversation. So please feel free to drop them in the chat for us. So welcome, Bryan. Thank you so much for making the time for being here today. How are you?
Very good. Thank you for having me, Sarah.
My absolute pleasure. So, Bryan, I wanted to take the time just for you to kind of introduce yourself to everybody. Can you walk us through who you are, your professional journey, and so on?
Sure. So welcome, everybody. My name is Bryan Waldeva, and I'm a vice president here at CGI, and I'm responsible for what we call our Wealth 360 solutions. So my background is actually technology. I started out, doing software development. I've had a variety of different roles in the wealth tech industry, everything from a developer to a business analyst to project manager, and then found my way into product management and marketing. And so at CGI, I head up our business around Wealth 360, which is our solutions for the wealth management industry.
Amazing. And I know we were just speaking before this, how you have a role that allows you to work with clients and colleagues globally. So that's pretty cool. Indeed. And I know you have hold a significant role in the CGI community as well. Would you mind just telling us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I have the very wonderful privilege to serve as the executive sponsor for our Rainbow Alliance, which is our LGBTQ2IA+ affinity member support group.
Amazing. And I definitely have the pleasure of working with the affinity group on several occasions. So that's awesome. So I know today's discussion is about impactful allyship, right? So I think a nice way to start the conversation is by defining what does allyship mean and what does it actually mean to you as well?
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny because I was talking about this with somebody the other day about, allyship and they kind of gave me this big sigh, like it was a very heavy topic. And I asked them, I was like, well, what comes to mind when I say ally? And they painted this wonderful picture of, I picture I have to have this giant sign and banner with me and go to a rally, and that's what it means to be an ally. I said, oh, that's interesting. And so we started talking about what allyship is. And so for me, allyship is fundamentally somebody outside of a group supporting an equity deserving group or need to help them obtain that equity. And that can take so many different forms. It can be influence, it can be support, it can be direct action, and there's so many things that come to mind when I think about allyship. I think somebody once described it very well for me, which is, there's kind of, think about it in relationship to somebody else, which is you can stand beside them, you can stand in front of them, or you can stand behind them.
Yeah.
And those are all different forms of ways to be an ally for somebody.
100%. And that actually sparks another conversation that I've had with you. You told me about an example of how you showcased allyship to someone. Would you mind kind of sharing the story with the audience?
Yeah, for sure. And so, in a professional capacity, one of the ways that I was able to be an ally for somebody was so I had a colleague of mine, and she was working on a proposal and a presentation that she had to do, and I asked her, how do you feel? Are you ready? You've got solid content there. I think it's going to be great. And she said, I'm really worried about how it's going to be perceived, if they're going to take me seriously, and if they're going to be open to my ideas. And it was bizarre from my perspective, because I looked at it and I'm like, this is a winning proposal. So how could it go wrong? But that in that moment, it clicked for me that what she really was asking me for was to be an ally for her. Yeah. And in presenting that content. And so, I asked her that very blunt question of, how can I support you? How can I help you? Right. And I think that's maybe the first step in engaging as an ally, is to understand the needs of somebody else that needs that support. And then what I was able to do was basically I did help lay the foundation in terms of setting the stage for her presentation, basically introducing her qualifications, and how she had done all this work and put together the proposal. I made sure I didn't want to steal any of her thunder in terms of presenting her amazing proposal and pitch, but I did want to lay the foundation for the audience about how credentialized she was, and that in that way I was able to be a great supporter and ally for her. And then as predicted, she won the bid, and we were all very excited for her.
That's honestly one of my favorite stories because the first step that you took is asking the person, how can I show up for you? Because, like you said in your definition of allyship, it really manifests in different ways, not specifically just as you did in your case where you stood up and you introduced her to everyone. But there's a lot of different ways, and it's important to make sure that the person feels comfortable and how you're expressing your allyship to them. And it's interesting the definition of having someone holding the sign. It is definitely one of the ways that to stand in solidarity, but there are definitely other ways in the workplaces and whatnot where you can showcase your allyship. So it's amazing.
Absolutely.
And that kind of leads me into my next question. So I know we just talked about, someone, woman in tech, the way you showcase your allyship for. So what's the difference between being an ally for an equity deserving group? And just for everyone to know, equity deserving group is essentially all the other underrepresented groups in our societies. So what's the difference between being an ally for them versus being an ally for women in tech?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, at the very fundamental core, there isn't much of a difference, right? At the end of the day, it's about, again, trying to be somebody that's outside of an equity deserving group, helping drive influence and helping that group actually obtain it.
Mm-hmm.
But there are always going to be differences in the needs for every group, right?
Yeah.
There are some equity deserving groups that I work with the Rainbow Alliance, for example, and some things aren't as visible, right? You can't tell if somebody just by looking at them is part of the sort of LGBTQ2IA plus community, whereas it's a lot easier to identify somebody visibly as a woman or somebody of color. So in that way, there are certainly different and unique needs. And it goes back to that concept of, really trying to understand a group by engaging with them on what the fundamental issues are. So I'd say, to answer your question very specifically, what's the difference? The difference is in what the specific needs are when you work with women in technology versus somebody that is maybe a member of the LGBTQ2I plus community in that. And they can have overlapping needs, right? There can be an intersection of the two, but that's where it really means something to be engaged fundamentally with every group and with people. At the end of the day, that's who you're supporting, is people. So just as everybody's different, everybody's needs are different, and so that's where the difference comes in supporting and being an ally.
I think that's very well said. And I like the fact that you mentioned that intersectionality, because someone could be a woman and they could also be part of another equity deserving group, right? So there's a lot of intersectionality and showing up for allyship. There's so many different needs that need to be catered for, but taking that question of asking, you said at the beginning, is as a way to address it. So that kind of leads into my next question. So, you mentioned in your introduction, you are in a leadership role, right? You're a vice president as well. So how do you define being an impactful ally, especially from a leadership perspective?
For sure. And it was something that, when we were posting about this session, some people had reached out to me and they said, oh, I really want to know what the difference is between, being a passive supporter and an active and impactful ally. How do I do that? Like, what are what's the difference? And I asked them, okay, like, tell me a little bit about yourself. And they said, well, I'm a new leader, and I'm just learning how to use my leadership to be an ally. And I said, well, that's a great start, right? The first step is understanding fundamentally, as a leader, you have a position of influence, right? And so that starts with that first sort of self of, what, I have an opportunity in front of me to leverage, whether it's a platform, whether it's influence in some sort of team or environment, to do something. And then to translate that into being an impactful ally,
Mhm.
it's really that word impact.
Yeah.
Is you want to do something that is going to actually drive meaning and value for an equity deserving group. And in
100%.
particular, I think there's a lot of opportunity for leaders in technology to advance and support and be active and impactful allies for women specifically in
Mhm.
technology. And so when we think about, well, what does it mean to be an impactful ally for women in technology? The first thing is, after you've identified all the opportunity and that, is make sure that you have women in technology,
Yeah.
and that you have voices at the table that are going to challenge some of the deep rooted assumptions, right? It goes back to the previous question you asked me, like, what's the difference between, supporting
Mhm.
and being an ally for different groups versus being an ally for women in technology? One of the things is, there's a lot of deep rooted sort of social norms around gender roles that you need to make sure you have an active voice in um, you know questioning and identifying to challenge some of those assumptions so that you can better engage with women
Mhm.
in technology. So for me, being an impactful ally as a leader is, one, recognizing that you have that opportunity; two, making sure you're bringing those voices to the table; and three, that you're really challenging, some deep rooted assumptions or thinking that might exist within the team.
100%. And I think even just at CGI, when we have, let's say, the Women in Tech, Women Mentorship Program, being involved as a mentor, even as an ally, is something that could help you being invested in those spaces and taking time out every day to attend the multiple organizations that are having events for International Women's Day or even
For
across
sure.
just International Women's Day, just to immerse yourself in the environment. Because I feel like when you understand someone's perspective from their own lens, you start to understand and see the struggles that maybe if you're not part of that group, I won't say you're blind to, but you don't see them because they're not natural part of your conscious state, not something you go through on a daily basis. So maybe
Sure.
immersing yourself in that environment will help you adopt a different perspective and understand the invisible challenges that women's and other equity deserving groups face.
Absolutely.
I know we have a question from the chat, Brian, so I want to plug it in to our conversation, which says, "My interest is team empowerment, team engagement, and team excellence. I would like to know more about tips to sustain and elevate all of them. It is more important in the times of disruption and continuous change." What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and first of all, thank you for that question. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about around that leadership opportunity, right?
Mhm.
And so it's a really good question around, how do I work with a team to drive and empower my team? And ultimately, if you can do both of those things, I think it will give you that team excellence that you're looking for. I'm a really strong advocate in the diversity in teams is a strength of those teams. But I'll answer that question very specifically. So, how can you empower and engage your team when it comes to allyship and making sure that everybody is contributing to allyship? I
Mhm.
think first and foremost, it really is about having a conversation, right? There's so many times where leaders maybe don't take the time to just call out the fact that it is a priority for the team, that diversity, equity, and inclusion are
Yeah.
all, priorities for our team. And that goes, to the fundamental need to drive culture in a team,
Yeah.
right? So a team that is high performing is a team that has a known culture and is working together. But then the key thing, specifically when we talk about being an ally for women in technology in those teams, is making sure, again, that you've got the right level of, I'll say, disruption in the
Yeah.
team, so that you have somebody that can challenge the thinking and the voices. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, but it's to help shift that team culture. So, you know what? It is okay to question assumptions. It is
Mhm.
okay to involve other voices and seek outside thoughts to make sure that we're performing. So some concrete tips that I can give you related
Mhm.
to that are: try including people outside of your team in your team
Yeah.
discussions and to challenge your ways of thinking. And then the other is to make sure that you do sit down with your team and have a very active conversation on what can we as a team do to be better allies for women in technology or for any other equity deserving group.
100%. And I think just to end off with that question, end off on your last point is the concept of team accountability, right? So building accountability into your teams, that if you're prioritizing, and you should, DE9 your team, it's a team effort. It's not just one person who's rolling the ball, but rather it's everyone hand in hand, because that's how you drive change. You're driving it together. You're not driving it alone. So it's really
Exactly
awesome.
right.
And that leads perfectly into kind of a next question, which talks about inclusive cultures, right? So how can leaders build inclusive cultures with their teams to be able to create a safe space, promote allyship, and also have an opportunity for people to present their authentic selves?
Yeah. So, one of my favorite sayings, and some of you might have seen or heard me say this is, I think the best thing anybody can do for themselves, for their teams, for their stakeholders, both professionally and personally, is to live their most authentic truth, right? And to live and to bring their full selves to everywhere they go, work included. And we recognize that that's not an easy thing to do. Whether you're a woman in technology, whether you're a member of another equity deserving group, sometimes there are barriers, conscious or unconscious, real or perceived, that are there. And so when you want to create that inclusive culture and environment, I think it needs really a few common things in that recipe. One is it needs to become a safe space for people to be themselves. And so how do you create a safe space? One is you really have to have a clear you have to drive clearly from as a leader, and have other people on your team drive clearly, a dismissal of any intolerance, right? So people need to know that if there is something that is going to be an issue, it's going to get addressed. So that's the first thing is, how do we ensure safety? And we ensure safety by actively shutting down behaviors that are not conducive to inclusivity. Then the second thing is also engaging and welcoming people to offer their opinions, right? So, if everything we do is just talk down to our teams, then we're never going to get input, right? So it's about making sure that we give dedicated time for each person, not whoever raises their hand first, but give everybody an opportunity to speak. So introducing those opportunities to speak. And then the third is leading by example. So I found the best way to get people on a team to be more inclusive is for me to just share about myself, and then actively wait and listen to hear from other people. And it's amazing what you hear people talk about, whether it's their home life, whether it's their family, whether it's their social interactions. It's whatever's relevant and important to them at the time. And so that's one really important aspect or ingredient in the recipe of creating an inclusive culture. And the fourth one, and probably the most difficult and the most important one, is creating an organic way for the team to constantly want to improve and better itself. And that's the hard one, right? The hard one is, do we have, as part of a monthly cadence, a quarterly, whatever the cadence is, do we have a forum where we get to talk about issues that are impacting our inclusivity and ways that we're going to address it? And it goes back to what you were saying, which is how do we have teams be accountable? And they can be accountable if they're forced, and it's part of the ingrained culture that we're going to sit down once a month and we're going to talk about, are we an inclusive team, and what are we going to do to be an inclusive team? That way, it's not on the shoulders of just one leader or one member or one team member. It's actually just part of our culture to do better.
100%. And do you feel like the four pro tips, I'll call them, are there any examples of maybe things that you've done personally with your teams that you've worked with in the past?
Yeah, for sure. And very relevant to, I'll say, recruitment. So, we had a role that had opened up, and I was working with a director on supporting them filling that role. And, I was like, oh, do you have candidates, and who are you interviewing? And I just asked to take a look at it because I was interested. And I noticed that they didn't have very many women. candidates that they were working with. And I said, oh, well, why is that? And I asked them in a team setting, and they said, well, it's a role that does require a fair bit of overtime, and it's probably not the most conducive to somebody that's, uh, more dedicated to their family. And I was like, okay, let's unpack that, right? Because I think there's a lot there that, we should challenge. And, I said, you know what, I'm not even going to challenge that. I'm going to ask somebody else on the team to challenge that. And so, I picked on somebody and I said, what are your thoughts, hearing that and saying that? And so a woman on my team jumped up and said, well, why do we assume that a woman can't fulfill that role, and that it's always the woman that's caring for the family and can't do that stuff, right? And they said, oh, I just kind of assumed that, and there was no ill intent, there was no malice, there was no ill will, but it was, again, challenging that assumption, and saying, you know what, that's actually just an assumption that you're making. And so I'm glad we had, one, the opportunity to help that leader, one, broaden their horizon, two, that we were able to get a woman on my team to advocate and also help her become an ally for other women, by providing that education, and most importantly, that finally at the end of the day we're actually able to get a woman into the role, in the technology role, to do that. So I think it was a win-win-win for me, going through that example with the team.
That's a wonderful example, and I love that you brought someone from the community to also just be able to shine light on that perspective. And I think there's a lot of, like you said, unpacking that we need to do there, because there's a lot of assumptions and stereotypes just throughout time have been naturally and organically, unfortunately, ingrained with us that no longer apply. So it's always nice to be able to challenge them, just to prove that, maybe back then, maybe they were more true. I put it in quotations, but not necessarily that it's something that applies in today's times, because as tech evolves, so does culture, so do many other things as well. So it's pretty cool.
Sure.
I wanted to go into another question from the audience, which says, given the increase in hybrid work, how do you see this impacting women's ability for promotion, since women are more likely to take remote or hybrid work, and there is a potential for proximity biases to take them, quote unquote, out of mind for leaders?
It's certainly, I'll say, more of a challenge in a remote working environment, for sure, but not because I think of the reasons that are mentioned there. I think it's because it's generally hard to have meaningful relationships, right? And understand someone's needs, and so it's the same kind of thinking around that director that I was working with, right? So by making that assumption, right, that what, women are going to need more remote because they're going to need to support their family, we're already doing a disservice to women, right, in technology. So first is challenge our assumptions, and maybe address the fundamental question, which is, do we have an issue with anybody that needs to support their families, whether it's a man or a woman? Well, then maybe we need to do something to address that issue, first of all, right? Then if that's not really the issue, then the issue is, maybe you want more in office time or whatever it is, then focus on those things. But I'd say at the end of the day, it isn't actually an issue, that it's specific to, women need more remote jobs or men need less remote jobs. That is actually, not, I don't think, the right way to go about answering that question. Is the job really needing to be in office or on site or face-to-face with clients or with the teams, or is there really a remote component? And if there's a remote component, then the actual thing that we need to do is focus on how do we create an engaging environment where people can be their full selves, where it's okay that you're on a call and your child walks into the room. That's normal. My dogs walk into the room. Sarah, we were talking about how your cat walks into the room, right? That's just life happening, and life takes a different, means different things and looks differently for different people. And so what we can do to be an ally in those situations is, again, to welcome people to be their authentic self, whatever
Mhm.
that life might look like, right? So it doesn't actually have to do with being a man or a woman and your needs. It has to do with, you know this is a conversation about remote work exposes a little bit more real life
Yeah.
in when we do work. And so that's how we can be impactful allies, is to actually not try to dismiss it or not try to hide it, but actually welcome it, so we can have an engaging conversation. So we can say, you know what, um, we're going to have a really important meeting. Can we all make sure that we have an environment where we're not going to have distractions, and have that level of conversation if you need to when it comes to remote or hybrid work?
Honestly, that was very well put. I could not have said it better. So wonderfully answered. And I definitely do agree. I think, again, going back to that assumptions and biases, why are we assuming that women might want more hybrid work or more remote work, but challenging those assumptions. But also, if you are a woman or someone else from an equity deserving group or someone else in general is in that position, have those conversations honestly and authentically with your teams, right? And placing importance on being comfortable asking for, let's say, accommodations if you need it as well. So it's pretty cool. And I do want to go. We have a couple more questions to go through, so I'll switch between the
Sure.
things that I want to talk about and the things
Yeah,
that
of
the
course.
audience are going through. So our third question is: how do unconscious biases manifest in the workplace, particularly within the tech sector, and what proactive measures can leaders take to mitigate their impact and foster a culture of inclusivity and belonging? What are your thoughts, Bryan?
Yeah, and there are definitely uniquenesses about the tech culture that make it, I'll say, um, more prevalent to have some certain unconscious biases,
Yeah.
especially around for women in technology. And I think there's a couple things. And when we think about technology, fundamentally what drives all of us passionately about technology is that it is something that we can use to solve problems.
Yeah.
And so, there's a natural tendency to, in order to solve a problem, one of the quick things that we do mentally, and it's kind of just ingrained in us as humans, it helps us solve problems, is to limit the scope and view of
Yeah.
what we're solving for, right? And you see this common issue in software development and software design, is you kind of forget who the end user is when you do software, and sometimes you lead to like really great complex solutions that are very difficult to use, and for a user it doesn't actually solve the problem. And that's a really good example of a natural bias that we have, which is when we want to solve problems, we tend to focus on driving a great solution, but
Mhm.
forgetting the needs. And so the unconscious bias there is that, you know, being strong technically or having a strong technical solution is the goal, but we forget that the goal is actually to solve the need. So the first thing that is the unconscious bias is not understanding the needs. And that doesn't just mean of the problem or the customer, but the needs of your team, the needs of your colleagues from that perspective. And then the other unconscious bias is, quite frankly, it is, you look at all the statistics, and technology has, I'll say, one of the biggest ways to go in terms of um, equity, and especially when
Mhm.
we look at the numbers, right, of
Yeah.
women in technology. There's, it's just very disrepresentative of, the world, where we see, you know, in many communities, in many cities, in many places in the world, there's a 50-50 split between men and women that just exist. And in fact, in some cases, there's more women than men
Yeah.
in some populations. But in the tech industry, it's very underrepresented, I'd say, for women in technology.
Yeah.
And so with that, you do get, unfortunately, this unconscious bias of, well, if I just talk to the people around me, everybody seems to want to do this, or everybody's doing this, and
Mhm.
then things become the norm, right?
Yeah.
So for example, oh yeah, we can all be in at eight, we can all work from 8:30 to 4:30, or you know what, um, we're all going to talk about certain things that we all care about, but sometimes those things aren't relevant for men versus women, or they're not relevant for people of different faiths, or there's just that group bias that sort of tends to happen when we have such a large gap in representation. And so one way to fight that unconscious bias is, again, to make sure that you bring that voice to the table of, you know, and it's not, it doesn't have to be this awkward thing of what's the women's perspective on this.
Yeah, for
It's
sure.
it's organic of, hey, what does everybody think, and make sure that everybody has a chance to answer that and give their thoughts, and that you're conscious of, what, this view is maybe underrepresented, so I'm going to give them more time to explain, and give us a perspective.
100%. I couldn't agree more. And the thing that I want to add is just because I've led the trainings just about unconscious bias. There's actually
Mhm.
tests available online for free, where you can test your unconscious biases. But I think it's a conversation that you need to have with yourself first, right? Because you
Yeah,
are going to be holding up essentially a mirror, looking at yourself and understanding that these are the assumptions that I have ingrained in me. These are the unconscious, or rather at this point conscious biases that are ingrained in me. So feeling ready to tackle them and mitigate them, so that when you make decisions when it comes to, let's say, hiring or performance or any of the other tasks that you have, whether in a leadership or non-leadership role,
yeah,
you're aware of the different biases that you are susceptible to, and that what helps you that's what helps you mitigate them. So I know there's a few resource, I think it's from Harvard, that you can probably also find online, and the many companies also have unconscious bias trainings that are facilitated. So that's what I would
for
also
sure.
suggest.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's really great. Thanks for adding that. And maybe one thing on that as well is,
Mhm.
it's easy to get um, this unfair perception that you have to be perfect all the time when
Yeah,
it comes to being an ally, right? I make mistakes, as an ally sometimes. I say the wrong thing, or I do something that actually detracts from my goal of
mhm.
empowering people sometimes. But that, it's not about being perfect, and it's not about, you don't have to understand everything fully. It's about making a commitment to yourself to acknowledge that you have some areas to improve, to do what you've just, articulated, which is uncover what your unconscious biases are, acknowledge them,
Exactly.
work on them, and then help others to identify and work on that. So, with my teams, that's something that I encourage everybody to do, which is, you know, what does everybody think that their unconscious biases are, and do we have a space where we can, you know call each other out on some of these biases and challenge each other to do better. So when you can create that system or that ecosystem where it's normal to talk to each other about our unconscious biases, to uncover them and work on them, then you kind of
Exactly.
relieve that weight of, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be committed to doing better and to encouraging others to help you do better.
100%. Then when someone is also sharing the same unconscious bias as you start to feel less alone.
Yeah,
So when you have those honest conversations and without, judgment-free zone, it's actually more beneficial than what you would assume it to be, especially since you're talking about a difficult topic rather. So 100%. Another question from Rihanna is, and this one's specifically for you, Brian. So, after COVID, social media has become our first ally to network with people. How do we make sure that we communicate effectively while making meaningful connections? Sometimes we are not able to showcase our best, and hence the other person loses interest in us. It's actually a very great question. So,
yeah, and it's funny because I also have a little bit of experience on sort of the marketing side, and
nice.
one of the first lessons I learned in marketing is, you can write the best ad with, all the best words, all the catchy phrases, and it can have zero impact.
Yeah.
And the reason it can have zero impact is because of the reach, and
Mhm.
particularly when we think about social media. Um, um, the first thing I want to say is maybe, um, I don't know if I would call social media an ally, but it's maybe a tool for allies to leverage. But when you're thinking about social media and how you can, market yourself or put yourself out there, um, it actually serves you better to have people engage with your content. And
Mm-hmm.
so the best thing that you can do is reach out to your network and have them repost something that you post,
Yeah.
right? And so if you actually look at all the algorithms in social media, they all rely on engagement, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for something to do well, it has to be not just seen, it has to be reposted and commented on,
Yeah.
right? And so this is where we can all help each other. And this is a way that you can actually be an ally in social media, which is when you see content from somebody that is part of an equity deserving group, when you see a woman colleague in technology saying something, amplify their voice,
Mm-hmm.
right? Repost it, comment on it, engage on it. And then you can actually help drive the visibility of their post. When I see a woman colleague in my network in technology that is saying that they're looking for a new role, I always repost it. I always share it, and I always connect them with somebody
Mm-hmm.
because that's how I can be an active, impactful ally for that person in that moment on social media. So I think the answer to that question is it's not about what you can do to improve your post and your showcase. It's about what you can do to help your network improve their reach.
110%. Very well said. And I think I like the words that you use, amplify their voices. Definitely the right word to use here, amplifying. So I wanted to go into another question, which talks about how can you stay informed on the different issues or celebrations? Are you talking about, let's say, the women in tech and amplifying their voices and your colleagues?
Mhm.
So there are issues, celebration, obstacles that individuals from underrepresented groups face.
Yeah. So we're very fortunate, as you know, at CGI, Sarah, to have the affinity groups that we have in Canada. So I think about, for example, Women of CGI Canada or
Mhm.
WCC as an amazing example of an affinity group that we have, and that's that. I'd say that's the start. So if you're a leader out there, or you're thinking about how can I help my company to improve allyship, one of the first things you can do is create a resource-based group
Yeah,
focused on identifying the needs of a particular group, right? And so
100%.
I'm so proud that we have Women of CGI Canada that, you know, they have a voice now, and then now I have access to important information about what our needs, what's the reality we're facing, what's the education that I need to put myself through to better understand that. And these are resources that are being put together, and that's how I get to stay informed, is actually participating in that. I think there's a really false assumption out there that something like Women of CGI Canada is only for women. I'd say the best thing I can do as an ally is to make sure I'm part of CGI as women affinity group or other affinity groups that I don't belong to, so that I can understand what's going on, what are ways that I can participate, what are ways that I can help and reach out. So, um, so one thing you can do is help others create that voice and then stay plugged into it. That's really it. And if you don't have access to something like that, engage the community. So
Yeah.
ask a woman in technology, what's it like being a woman in technology? And I want to know more. That conversations and understanding people. At the end of the day, it goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning. Allyship is about helping people.
Yeah.
So talk to people, and they will tell you what their needs are.
100%. Wonderful. And I think it also aligns with what I said earlier, is engage with your communities, engage with your people, learn from them so that you can adopt that different perspectives, right? And stay up to date and understand that also challenges, obstacles, celebrations change throughout time, right? So staying
Yeah.
up to date is important to also stay as a true and valuable ally as well. So I wanted to also ask you, Bryan, just what the question about the social media also sparked another question in my mind, which was if there is someone who maybe suffers from confrontational issues or social anxiety, but they really want to, but they want to be a great ally. What's your advice for them?
Yeah. Um, you know, I said at the beginning, about that example of the person I was talking to about how they pictured, I have to be rah rah with a flag and some
Mhm.
sort of banner at a rally. And I was like, oh, that thinking makes it very challenging for a lot of people to want to be an ally,
Yeah.
because not everybody is comfortable doing that. And so it's a very good question because there's no one right way to be an ally.
Yeah.
But one thing that successful allies all have in common is, and I keep saying it, which is ask, right?
Yeah.
So there are certain things that I'm not the greatest with. Sometimes understanding like what events are out there,
Mhm.
or getting informed. That's a blind spot I have because I find I'm so busy, and I'm not always the best at staying informed. And so, I talk to women in technology that are around me on my team, my colleagues, some of my mentors, and other people in the network, and I was like, oh, what can I do to be better informed? Or what my talents are. I think I'm generally good at talking to people, and I'm good with technology. How can I use my strengths to
Yeah.
help be an ally? So it's not about looking a certain way or doing certain things. So if you're trying to avoid confrontation, or if you're not comfortable in certain situations, maybe ask the inverse question, which is, what are the things that you do enjoy and that you are
Yeah.
good at, and how can those be used to be an ally? So that's maybe the first answer. The
Mhm.
second answer is, it's not about you having that difficult conversation, or you confronting something. It's about creating a culture where we challenge assumptions. And so sometimes the best thing you can do is recruit other people to do that, right? So I'll give you a very good example. We go through the talent review and performance assessment process. We have this
Mhm.
concept of really having somebody that is an inclusion interrupter.
Yeah.
And what they do is it's somebody that we bring in from outside of the group, that is going to challenge ways of thinking and question biases that might occur, especially when we do something like talent reviews. And so now I'm not the person that has to confront somebody with their issues. I can have somebody else. So again, it's about creating that environment where challenges are being presented to
Mhm.
certain biases, and we're questioning certain assumptions. It's not about confronting.
100%. And definitely, I think when I heard about the inclusion of the inclusion interrupters, thought it was a wonderful idea, right? Because you have someone there who is consciously there to challenge the assumptions, to make recommendations, and to better build inclusion into the teams or into the project, or whatever the purpose is. So 110%, very well answered. And I think there, like you said, different ways to showcase allyship. It's not about holding the poster and walking down, but really asking yourself, what are my strengths? What ways am I comfortable showing? And then when we go back to the first step of what we said, ask the person how do they want the allyship to be shown or expressed. Tie all those elements together, and then usually it works out pretty well. So thank you, Brian. Um, I have another question from the chat, which is, what key advice would serve as impactful allyship for women transitioning into tech and seeking internship positions?
Um, so I think the the best advice, I'd say, transitioning into technology, and maybe seeking internship, is um, growing your network.
Mhm.
That's maybe the first step, right? Is because it is, unfortunately, such a male-dominated industry, which
Yeah.
we're working on actively changing. The thing that I would recommend is, um, start to form a network of other women, but also just other people in the industry, right? Your network is very important, and as part of your network, I would very much encourage you to consider, if you don't have one, getting a mentor,
Yeah.
or even two mentors, right, or multiple mentors, if you can. because mentorship is such an important part of, I'll say, advancing your career, especially in the technology space. Having a sounding board. We in technology, we're solving problems, real business problems. It's a very evolving industry all the time. Teams are always changing. It's a very dynamic industry. I'll put it that way. And so having somebody that can, help you form your North Star to guide you or to talk through your projects or talk through about your career and give you some, perspective, that's so critical and key. So I'd say that the critical advice I give to somebody, to a woman specifically that is moving into the tech industry is make sure you form a good network and get yourself a mentor if you can, or at least one, if not multiple mentors, to help shape your path. Don't try to take this on as a solo mission.
100%. And just for everyone's reference, there tomorrow morning at 11:30, there's a Power of Mentorship and Sponsorship session that's being led by a woman leader. So if you're interested in learning more about how to find a mentor, all these things, I think that's a wonderful session to be into. I know we have only a few minutes left, so I will ask one more question, and then I think we'll conclude our chat for today. But there's a question here from the chat, which is, how do you boost your coworkers' morale and maintain your relationships while going through management change when you're mediating the differences between the new manager and your coworkers?
Yeah, it's when we talk about allyship, sometimes we think it's a heavy thing, right? And that it comes at the cost of morale. But at the end of the day, an inclusive culture is one that usually has a higher morale. But how can you improve morale? One of the reasons why morale is low isn't because it's a stressful environment or the work is hard or the hours are long. Morale is often low because people don't have one of a few things. They don't feel respected, they don't feel recognized, and they don't feel empowered, right? So if any of those three are lacking, that's when morale goes down. So what can you do to help improve those things? Well, the first is focus on one, making a safe environment again so that people can bring their full and authentic selves, right? People are only going to feel respected if they're able to be themselves and know that that's valued, right? So one, we have to make sure that, again, it's safe from a communication perspective and we don't tolerate behaviors that are not conducive to a safe and welcoming environment, and that we enforce everybody gets treated with respect. So, sometimes that's just laying down some ground rules for how we interact with each other. Other times that's just having, positive interactions and setting an example. Then the next thing you can do is recognize members. And I don't just mean for great code or for great designs or great tech solutions. I mean, recognize people for their contributions to the team and to the culture and what they bring so that people feel valued. And then the third is, how do you empower people? And it's the same concept when it comes to allyship, which is it's not always about you, right? It's about, what can you do to stand behind or beside somebody sometimes. So I'll give you that example again where, I saw that there was an unconscious bias, but I saw that somebody else knew how to address it. So I asked that woman colleague of mine to voice the opinion so that somebody from the community that's engaging with it. So it's examples like that. It doesn't always have to be, oh, well, I'm going to give you, control over a budget. You can't always do that, but you can always identify an opportunity for someone to shine with their strengths or take on a challenge. So if you can do those things, that's how you actually improve morale. It's not by thinking about how much remote work versus in-person work. It's not about by reducing the amount of hours. It's not about that. It's about making an environment where we all want to live and work.
110%. And when you're able to bring your authentic self to work without worrying about any judgment or worrying about anything else. So I 110% agree. So I think that was all the questions that I have today for you, Bryan. And I want to thank you sincerely so much for your time. I honestly had so much fun with this conversation, and I'm learning so much from you as well. So I hope you had just as much fun. And I want to thank you again for spending time for our Women in Tech Career Lab here at CGI.
Thank you so much for having me. It was wonderful.
My absolute pleasure. And I just want to remind everyone, so we're going to have a QR code that's going to show up on the screen, right? So we have our last session today, which is seizing opportunities, mapping career success. I'm going to give you a little secret. It's a wonderful session. I've seen a little bit of sneak peek, so I really suggest you go to the session that is at 2:30 p.m. And I want to thank everyone again for their time, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.